Welcome to the Reed Talk Podcast, the podcast designed to bring information, reed-making tips, and lightheartedness to your reed-making desk. Each podcast features a leading oboist in our field and does a deep dive into a question on every oboist's mind. How do I become a more successful reed maker? Joining us today to share her insight on reed making is Mary Lynch, principal oboist of the Seattle Symphony and oboe faculty at University of Washington. Let's talk reeds. I'm Courtney Miller.
And I'm Margaret Marco.
Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise on reed making.
Well, thanks for having me, Courtney.
So we're going to start with the nuts and bolts. Can you tell us a little bit about your setup?
Sure. So I guess I'll actually start with the oboe because I think our reeds are really influenced by the type of instrument that we play. Mm-hmm. So right now I'm playing on a Luray B series copy. And before that I was on Luray AKs my entire career. And I use a Ferrillo gouge and all of his associated pre-gouging materials. I use mostly Glotin tubes. Or lately, I've also had some Stevens tubes in the mix from Advantage USA double reeds. They're a company close to Seattle. Let's see, shaper tip. I use the Mac++ now. I have been on that for the last 6 months or so, but before that, it was mostly Mac+. Sometimes the Gilbert one is thrown in there.
So on your Mac++ shaper tip, what's your tying length?
It depends a bit on the piece of cane for me. I don't always tie it exactly the same length, but typically it's 72 millimeters. If the diameter of the piece of cane is like 10 as opposed to 10.5, I might tie on at like 72 and a half. Or if it's a really hard piece of cane, I might tie on a little bit longer just to get a little bit more leverage at the top.
Is there any other equipment that you want to share with us today that you use or have found improves your reed making?
I think that the knives that you use have a pretty big effect on your reeds. I use a combination of knives. So I use the Harvard double reed, that large, heavy beveled knife for taking off bark. And I'm able to get a lot of cane off really quickly.
Yes.
I was actually just messaging another oboe player about profilers the other day, and I told him I've never thought to use a profiler because I feel like I can just take off that amount of cane in 2 minutes with my big heavy-duty knife. So, and then I use something that's kind of in between a finishing knife and like a heavy-duty knife. Mm-hmm. It's one of the old RDG double hollow grounds.
Yeah.
I don't think they make them quite like that anymore. And then for finishing, I use a Landwell double hollow ground.
Well, the knives do make a big difference. So thank you for mentioning that and sharing that part of your process with us.
Sure.
Who are some of your reed making mentors?
Well, all of my teachers. Started with Dan Stolper, may he rest in peace. And then John Ferrillo, of course, had a huge influence on my reed making process. And I think studying with him for 4 years, as I did for my undergrad, that influence is definitely, by and large, still there. I do basically the same process for making a blank and almost all the way to a finished reed that I did when I was in college. And then for finishing reeds, I learned a lot from Nathan Hughes and Elaine Duvas. Those were my two teachers in my master's degree. And so I was kind of able to draw on some different influences there and figure out that finishing puzzle a bit more on my own and put together the puzzle that worked for me.
Fabulous. If you don't mind, I'd like to backtrack just a little bit to the hardness of the cane. You said that you change your tie length based on whether the cane is hard or not. How do you determine the cane hardness before you make that decision?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, at this point, I can kind of just tell.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of practical advice for someone trying to figure that out, I think there are a few different factors. One, it doesn't necessarily influence hardness, but it's often a good indicator how thick the walls of the tube are when you're sorting cane. Mm-hmm. Typically, if it has thicker walls, it's more likely to be a harder piece of cane. Those really thin-walled tubes, that's not going to be a hard piece of cane. So
Right.
I would probably tie those on a little bit shorter or just not use them at all. Then if you're able to look at the vascular bundles, like the little grains inside the tube of cane, once you slice it open, that'll kind of give you an idea of the quality. If they're really tight and close together, it's more likely that it's going to be a harder piece of cane. But my favorite test is just after you've found a piece that has that consistent diameter and straightness, and you've sliced and diced, you can take it by both ends and just twist it between your fingers. And if it's really easy to bend, then I know, okay, that's going to be a pretty flimsy piece of cane. Maybe the reed will last me like a few days. But if it's really hard to bend, then I'll know, okay, this is a reed that might be a little harder to work with at first, which is why I tie on slightly longer, because it makes it easier to get closure at the top of the reed. But those reeds tend to last longer for me.
Right. So it's a physical attribute at first, but there's also a tactile determination by that twisting. So a couple of different factors go into determining like the quality of the cane before you even take the knife to it, really, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's so cool. I don't know if everybody always thinks to look at the thickness of the walls of the tube cane. So that's a very helpful tip. Okay, so you've got all this in place, your shaper tip, and you know how to pick a great piece of cane. So when you get that dream reed, can you describe that for us? What is the perfect reed for Mary Lynch?
Oh, the elusive dream reed. I think it's like that reed that has the perfect balance of all things. So like a reed that's that balance between stability and flexibility. I think that's the number one thing for me, because odds are if I have a reed that is balanced in that way, that's just the right amount of flexibility to let me do all the things I want to do, and the right amount of stability to make it easy for me to do those things, then it's probably also going to have an amazing tone and ease of response and everything else. So that's kind of the thing that I focus on the most with my reeds.
Do you have any trusty reed tests that you take your reeds through to determine that this is a dream reed or not?
Yeah, I'm not super religious about my tests. I don't always do the same exact test for every reed. I think what it boils down to is how the reed responds. I like doing an aspirated attack, so just the air only and slowly increasing that air to see at what point does the reed respond, at what point does it speak, and what's the quality of that sound. Does it start the sound abruptly, or does it start the sound with a lot of cushion to it? That's a really helpful test. And then the other test that I do consistently is just flicking the second octave key to make sure that my reed is doing most of the pitch holding work for me.
So, Mary, I know that you have a new CD with the concerto performance that is just released.
Yeah, it was just released a few weeks ago, I think.
Oh, congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
So the next question is about your reed preparation for recording sessions. How do you approach making reeds? How far in advance? How many do you like to have? That kind of thing.
That's a really good question, because recording sessions are different from live performance. In a recording session, if you start playing and you don't like your reed, you can always stop and switch, which we don't have that luxury when we're playing live. I think, though, by and large, my process is pretty much the same when it comes to the preparation involved. I always like to have options, right? No one wants to walk on stage with one reed that works. Nope. So I try to stockpile some reeds before a big performance, whether it's a live concert or a recording session. And I think the most important factor for me when it comes to choosing the reed, besides just all the standard things like does it respond, is it up to pitch, does it have a nice sound, is how well I know that reed. So I want to make sure that whatever reed I choose, especially for a recording session, that I've played through the entire piece on it multiple times so that I know that the reed can handle it.
Your reeds sound like they're pretty durable. Do you break them in?
I mean, it also depends. I think some reeds, they might last me a week or just a couple of concerts or just one concert. Other reeds I can play on. Of course, I ration them, right? So I don't practice on the same reed for like 3 weeks. But if I get one that is really feeling good, I can just save that for strategic moments. Let's say I'm preparing to record a piece, and a few weeks before, I'm starting to really run through everything and trying to narrow down my reed choices. If I find a reed that I really like that week, I'll put it in my case, won't touch it until maybe a week later, and then I'll play through the piece again on that reed and see if it still feels as good. And if that's the case, I'll put it away and I'll take it out to warm up on the day of the recording.
Well, thanks for diving into that. I really appreciated the clear methodology that you have in explaining that. It gives me a clearer picture. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Once again, I want to go back to something you talked about. You're still using the same process of scraping a blank to a finished reed. And I think it'd be really helpful if you could explain your process for doing that.
Yeah, sure. In a nutshell, what I do is I try to get the top half of the reed, so the tip and the heart, looking basically in the ballpark of being finished before I really touch the back. So after I've tied on the piece of cane onto the tube and it still has all the bark on it, I go and I outline exactly where I'm going to start the tip. And that stays pretty consistent all the way through to a finished reed for me. I know some people prefer the technique of starting the tip higher and then moving it back as you finish the reed, which it can give you this nice layered effect at the base of the tip. And if you do it well, it can create a really beautiful sound. But for some reason, I find it more efficient to just start the tip where it's going to be. And that ends up working well for me. So I do that. I take the bark off of the tip and maybe into a few more layers of cane. And I check to make sure through the backlit view that it's nice and even on all quadrants. Then I go into the heart and I just scrape evenly the bark off of the entire heart, go down another layer or two. But now I'm starting to establish the balance between the tip and the heart. So I want to make sure always that the heart is thicker than the tip. And then I work a little bit more. So I'll go back, I'll take a few more layers of cane off of the tip, maybe one more layer of cane off of the heart, and I'm preparing to get it ready to be clipped open. So I don't scrape it extraordinarily thin at the tip to clip it open because I want to make sure that I don't scrape through the piece of cane before there's a plaque in there. I leave a nice safety buffer there in terms of tip thickness before I clip it open. And then after I clip it, I slide the overlap into place. It should have a nice click, and then grab the plaque somewhat vigorously on the sides. And then I just keep doing the same thing. Thin the tip. Maybe I'll go back and thin the heart a little bit. And as I'm working on these two sections, I'm really trying to work on them simultaneously. So I don't want this huge cliff in between the tip and the heart, but I do want clear definition at the same time. So I end up doing these scrapes where I'll start in the heart and then scrape through the heart lightly and then lightly over that transition period between the tip and the heart. And then I'll go in and really finish out the corners of the tip. And I do that quite a lot to encourage the whole thing to vibrate, as a unit and to vibrate cohesively. Anyway, this is a bit long-winded, but I'm almost done.
No, this is fantastic. I'm learning so much.
Once I'm able to peep on it and make some sound and feel like it's vibrating, and I don't want it to be vibrating too much because, remember, I haven't scraped anything out of the back yet. But I do want to feel that I'm getting some good response from the top half of the reed. And then my final test for when I'm ready to scrape in the back is I'll hold the reed up to a backlit view